Edward Snowden revealed the existence of a program the NSA is running called Prism. Prism is a program that allows the NSA to, without an explicit warrant, request communications information from multiple commercial communications providers like YouTube, Microsoft, Google, Facebook, some other services, and they can do so without the explicit or transparent granting of a warrant through an open court. They use a court called a FISA court, which is a secret intelligence court that's been developed out of concerns over domestic spying since the Church Commission in the 1970s.
One of the interesting things about this is for people who follow surveillance, while some of the players are new and some of the details are new, this isn't particularly new. The New York Times won a Pulitzer Prize 6 or 7 years ago for revealing many of the same things that were released in the documentation. So what's new about it is that some of the information's been leaked, and there's a lot more information. But as Michael suggested, the FISA court's been around for a long time. And most of what they're doing was stuff that came in after 9/11, certainly not in the last year or two.
One of the other things that were revealed was this FISA court has in the among 33,000, 35,000 requests for these wiretappings, there's only been 11 times where the court has said that they were not permitted to do it, which raises the question of how much oversight this court is actually doing.
And so the FISA court's been doing this, as Michael suggests, for a long time. And there's always, when you read the documentation, the congressional testimony, the Department of Justice and others are always complaining about the barriers put in place by the FISA court. But the FISA court approves almost everything. And of the 11 they didn't approve, I'm guessing 5 or 6 of them were technical declines. And once they provided the right information, they were able to go ahead and do what they wanted to do. The government asserts that they need to be able to do this kind of surveillance to keep track of potential terrorist threats. So a lot of surveillance like this was done in a less technological form for the last 100 years or so. This is what governments do. They attempt to get information about their citizens. But they're asserting now that the new technology makes the threat more powerful, and that if they have the capabilities to monitor that threat, then it's worth some retrenchment of liberty to achieve greater security.
We've had an advancement of NSA and even military operations in the wake of 9/11, in the wake of terrorist attacks, and there are many for whom these advancements that were meant to be temporary. The Patriot Act, for example, had an expiration date on it that's been extended multiple times. There is some concern over these temporary emergency rules being made permanent or being altered in secret. There's also this concern about the degree to which the sort of technological ability to monitor people's communications dampens or makes more difficult the opportunity to dissent at all. And that's a major concern in our democracy. In our government, which has given certain, has safeguarded certain activities as vital to the operation of a free and open democracy. Now we have pressure being put on, or the opportunity for intimidation and pressure being put on people based on the government's ability to monitor what they do, who they speak with, for how long, et cetera.
But this is not about Democrats and Republicans. This is about what governments do. Our government's been doing it for decades under Democrats and Republicans. It is humorous to me, as someone who spent a lot of time researching surveillance in the 60s, to see Republicans on the side of liberty in this case, because they're just flipping roles. And it's not simply because one party's in office as opposed to the other. We have this kind of flipping in American politics where Republicans have sort of claimed the mantle of individual rights against big government, which used to be the Democrats' role. But while you're free to be disappointed with Obama, he's not doing anything different than others have done. If you hold him to a higher standard, you're disappointed. If you see him as someone who is running a government, then you're not surprised. There's a story in the paper recently about all the governments in Europe being offended by this because it was revealed that they were spying on the governments. Those governments in Europe, they're doing exactly the same thing if they have the technology to do it. And if they don't, they wish they did.
One of the things I think is interesting is that in Edward Snowden's discussions with The Guardian, he explicitly says that one of the things that motivated his release of information was a disappointment with the Obama administration, which, from his perspective, he thought would mark a new era for respect of privacy, right? So we were coming out of this 2006, 2007 scandals regarding warrantless wiretapping. And just in the last, say, 2 years, Snowden had decided that this is in fact not changing, that there's a continuity of these, and perhaps even a more intense prosecution of whistleblowers, people like Bradley Manning, the treatment of an organization like WikiLeaks being harsher and harsher. So I think it's been interesting just sort of internally, the internal politics of it, or perhaps the perception of politics, and then externally, where we have many, many people who were extremely critical of things like the warrantless wiretapping during the Bush administration, not being as willing to be as critical of the Obama administration. And I think there's a strange sort of red team, blue team kind of like loyalty being going on, as opposed to the discussion of policies. So it becomes, Snowden versus Obama instead of, say, I don't know, desire for a transparent legal framework for surveillance versus, unchecked surveillance authority or something like that.
There's a certain way in which when Democrats say, look, we trust Obama doing this, we didn't trust Bush, and vice versa. Or Republicans saying, well, if we trusted Bush, now we don't trust Obama. What's interesting to me in terms of the politics of this is I taught for several years here, I taught courses on surveillance, and you would reveal this information to students and they would kind of yawn. And one of the things I think that's showing up in the response to this is most people are kind of saying good. Not we're offended by our liberty, but we're concerned about our security. It's most people don't see the interception of their emails as anything that's going to bother them. And they tend to be kind of blasé about it. When you go back through documents that have been classified in the past, you find a whole range of information. Some of it's hard to know why it was classified. Some of it was obviously, for obvious reasons, classified. And some of it is just stuff that embarrasses the government. So the government will classify things they don't want people to know, including all the procedures for collecting the information. If you just to go back to the sort of the example from the past, when the Patriot Act was passed, it made the revelation that you'd gotten a subpoena from them illegal. So you couldn't even go to court to contest it because you couldn't admit to anyone that you'd even gotten it. So there's this way in which secrecy sort of loops into itself to create a difficult to sort of maneuver in world.
It's also nearly, because of the reasons we talked about before, it's really difficult to rationalize the legal process because the legal rationale is itself classified. So we can't know why the interpretation of the Patriot Act, or what the new interpretation of the Patriot Act that allows for the FISA court operating the way it is, or Prism operating the way it is. We can't have a national discussion about that. And in fact, United States senators, many United States senators do not have the ability to understand this, which is problematic when we think about the way that these branches of government are supposed to, check one another. I would say that the revelations regard the process by which certain surveillance activities are made legal. So I think everybody was fairly aware, and this being, United States citizens and, malevolent actors around the world, I think everybody is aware that the United States had the capability to monitor their email or tap their their cell phones or gather information about the people they associate with. I mean, we've all seen The Wire. But I think the interesting thing to me was the way that that there was a legalization sort of theater going on. That to me was the troubling part, that we have this court that nobody can know about that basically approves everything that comes before them for reasons that we can't know about. I mean, I think that's what's been troubling for a lot of people.
And Snowden, in some ways, has really turned the tables on the United States government here, because in the past, the United States government collected secret information. They would decide what information to release and when. So they might go to court and release certain kinds of information, not others, or they might just leak it to the public through the news media or something like that. But now Snowden's got this bucket of information that he has about what the US government's done. And he's deciding when to release it and what to release. So they recently released the information that the United States had been doing surveillance of European governments during certain international meetings. Well, that's clearly embarrassing to the United States and clearly was released in intention to embarrass. It'll be different if it releases information that says, and this isn't true as far as anyone knows, that 10 terrorists were caught with this activity. So he's really, in some ways, in charge of the framing right now, because he gets to decide what information will be leaked and when.
Right. I mean, there was a good article in, they all just blend together, don't they? I think it may have been Chris Hedges, regarding the double standard regarding certain intelligence leaks. So a senator can come out and say, since 2000, we've stopped 90 terrorist plots here. Now, we can say with relative certainty that information is probably classified. However, this leak of classified information is considered just sort of political maneuvering or justification, whereas other leaks of classified information that may or may not jeopardize, American national security, that's considered, a sort of global catastrophe. So I think that's an interesting sort of consequence of all these revelations, is that we're starting to sort of reframe the question. So, like, what is an intelligence leak? Is it always bad? Are these actually political definitions? All those sorts of things.
So in my interaction with students around these issues, they are very laissez-faire about it. They don't seem upset at all.
I think that in general, people understand that the service provider, any broad way we imagine that, whether that service is actually access to the internet or whether it's a social media service like Facebook, or an email provider like Google, I think people are relatively comfortable with the idea that these people control their data, and we see this every time Facebook changes their privacy settings, that there's a sort of consumer-provider push and pull regarding these things. People are willing to grant that Facebook is going to have access to some certain kinds of data, but it becomes a question of, what are we as consumers going to allow in this relationship? I think the question of the government having unilateral access to all these materials or communications outside of, very particular services. So I think people are okay with the government, Facebook sort of data mining their messages and using it to sell ads to them. I think people are slightly less okay with the idea that the government could track all your communications, all your Google searches, all of your likes on Facebook, and perhaps use that information to put pressure on you or put pressure on people who you associate with, to perhaps undermine your sort of like political activism. I mean, I think people at that point get very concerned. And we've seen internet communities sort of like start to build this into their sort of community ethos. So people like Anonymous or the Electronic Frontier Foundation, who Edward Snowden was a supporter of. I think that is where we're seeing privacy concerns sort of be really articulated on the internet.
There's an interesting way in which all this corporate collection of data, I think, changes people's perceptions. So it used to be that you would talk about governments as people who control the monopoly of the use of violence. So no one else is supposed to use violence except for the government and police and things like that. It's very clear now that surveillance has taken up, is a major form of social control now. But it's also very clear that the government doesn't own most of the surveillance information. So all this consumer surveillance that goes on, people have gotten very used to the idea that companies collect information on them and use it to try to shape their behavior in certain ways, try to influence them to purchase certain things, feed them certain kinds of information and not others. And I think to a significant degree that has lessened people's concerns, whether that's right or wrong, about surveillance in general. So I am in some ways more concerned because there's less democratic controls on it, about the possibility that large corporations can collect lots of information about you and try to influence your behavior, than I am about governments, because I assume governments are doing it.
There's a concern about the sort of ability to combine the power to collect information and the monopoly on violence that I think makes government surveillance, or at least government access to corporate surveillance. I mean, that's really what Prism is that the government isn't out there tapping into all our information. They're actually, and an amendment to FISA court law in 2008 immunizes private companies from any lawsuits about sort of bulk handing over information, which was a disappointment to many people, myself included, at the time. So there's a combination about the government having access to all this sort of private information, as well as having the ability to send FBI agents into your house. And we've seen this not only in this country, but lots of concerns about surveillance and control over the internet in other countries. And I think that's fed into people's reconsideration of what is the internet's political role and what rights do we need to safeguard on it. I think that, I heard this somewhere else, I can't remember exactly where, on the radio, I think. If you think about, people seem blasé about metadata, which is who have you called, who have you emailed, how long are these things, what keywords are in there. But if you think about a FBI agent coming to your door and saying, I would like you to hand over this month, it's your monthly report day, you have to hand over all the numbers of all the phone calls you made, the recipients of all your emails. Don't worry, you don't need to tell me what you said, but I do need all this information. I think we would be creeped out by that. But less so when it happens out of our sight. And I think it's important that, I think there's a great opportunity here that this is now in our field of vision and we can just talk about it and decide what we think is appropriate.
The other corporate government connection that we should explore here at least a little bit is that Snowden wasn't working for the federal government. Snowden had worked for the CIA, I believe, or NSA, but he wasn't working for them at the time. He was working for a private company that contracted to do intelligence work for the government. I find that nexus to be really troubling, that we would hire private companies to do that kind of government work. It has something to do with ideology and making government smaller, although the irony here is too rich, that you would make government smaller by contracting out your government surveillance work to private corporations. But I think that's something I hope gets a lot of exploration in this discussion as well.
So I think the polling shows about a 50-50 split in terms of whether, people believing whether Snowden did the right thing or not, about a 50-50 split, maybe 58-42 in terms of whether people think that Snowden should be prosecuted. But I think the generational concern or question is interesting because if you think about the justifications now, as we talked about before, these activities or these kinds of activities just go back to as far back as the United States government could collect information. But the justifications for a lot of these have to do with 9/11. Now, Edward Snowden is 3 years younger than me, which means he was 17 or 18 when 9/11 happened. And in large part, I think the enormous trauma, right, the rupture, the historical rupture that 9/11 represented as being something that an entire generation of people, since Pearl Harbor or something, hadn't had to deal with in terms of the United States, that allowed certain kinds of political changes to be made without much opposition. So things like the passing of the U.S. Patriot Act and things like that. I wonder to what degree people younger than me, say, whether that, the sort of emotional appeal of we can't let something like that happen again, whether that starts to lose its rhetorical force, whether we can just say, I mean, as the joke went about Rudy Giuliani's presidential campaign, noun, verb, 9/11, whether that's wearing off among some people, partially because of just time, partially because people of a certain generation have always lived in a sort of like terrorism is the number one global threat, and also partially because I think there's just a concern about trust. Can you trust somebody who says, no, 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 we need this for national security? And, you know, we've had a lot of sort of reasons to believe that we're not always being told the truth. So, you know, from the concerns about weapons of mass destruction to, you know, enhanced interrogation techniques, which is just torture, to even weeks before Snowden's revelations, we had the Director of National Intelligence telling Congress in a public hearing, we're not collecting information on millions of Americans. I think there's a degree to which the public trust or faith in the national security apparatus to do the right thing, I think there's a danger in that eroding. If people fully felt that this information was, they had full trust in these institutions, I think people would be actively angry with Edward Snowden. And we've seen that some places, but in general, we've not seen a mass outcry. And I think that's noteworthy. I think it's interesting.
There's always a threat, though, right? So the FBI is built first on the threat of white slavery, then on the threat of foreign anarchists, and then on the threat of communists. And now terrorism is the new threat that's used to justify a whole series of things. This is not to deny that there's a terrorist threat, but it is to point out that since 9/11, there's been a tremendous increase in the amount of social control without a tremendous discovering of lots of terrorist threats in the borders of the United States are coming from somewhere else. In retrospect, we always conclude that we went too far and that the threat was less than we thought. And so we will conclude that again, more than likely in 20, 30 years, about what's going on right now.